So in the other video for this week, I started talking about blind trials. In this video, we're going to continue that story. So we'll talk a little bit more about the development of blind trials and then double-blind trials and placebos, finally ending up with the randomized control group. So we get the final randomized double-blind controlled study. Okay, so the next part of the story that I want to pick out from you from Kapchuk's, the readings for this week by Kapchuk, is homeopathy. So homeopathy was developed in the sort of late 1700s and in the early 1800s by a man named Samuel Hahnemann. Here's a statue of Samuel Hahnemann, and you can see underneath it is carved this slogan, similibus curantur, I think is how you say it. Essentially, that means like. And that's the basic idea of homeopathy and the kind of slogan of its treatment plan. Like cures like. So the central idea is that, for example, if you have a disease that involves a fever, if you give the patient something that increases their body temperature, sort of simulates a fever, that thing will help cure them. So give them something that causes the same symptoms that they're experiencing, and that will help cure them. So, and homeopathy is treatment by the same. So like cures like. That's the basic idea. Yeah. So Hahnemann also believed that if you introduce an ingredient into water, so you've got an ingredient that, say, raises your body temperature, you use it for treating fevers. If you introduce that ingredient into water and shake it up and sort of dissolve it into the water, you release some of the spiritual vital essence of that ingredient. And then furthermore, if you take that water and then take maybe, say, a couple of drops of it and put it into more water, dilute it, you actually increase the degree of spiritual vital essence. So you got the ingredient, you put it in some water, shake it up, take a little bit of that water, put it into different water, shake it up, you increase the spiritual vital essence. You take that and dilute it again, and you keep doing that, so diluting and shaking, and you get increasing amounts of spiritual vital essence. Homeopathic remedies are typically so diluted that, statistically speaking, it's unlikely that even a single molecule of the original ingredient is present in the final diluted form. It's just water. But according to homeopathic thinking, that water contains some memory of the ingredient that's been enhanced by dilution. Okay, so this became very popular in the 1800s. To be honest, if it was the 1800s, I would probably prefer a homeopathic doctor too. Not because I think that there's anything whatsoever of use in homeopathic cures, but just because what other doctors were doing was pretty horrifying. So standard medical practice included a lot of bloodletting and putting leeches on you. They would give you powerful purgatives to make you vomit and have diarrhea, to kind of clean out your tubes. Medical intervention at that time was very dramatic and often quite harmful to the body, as what we would currently say. So by comparison, homeopathic remedies are pretty safe. They're just water. So if I was to choose between 1800s, purgatives and leeches or some water, I'd probably pick the water personally. So it's better than the alternative. And nonetheless, people were pretty skeptical of the homeopathic idea, even back in the 1800s. So a French doctor named Armand Trousseau, who practiced standard medicine, and seeing the kind of craze for homeopathy, decided that he wanted to try it out. He wanted to do an assessment of this stuff. So he did placebo trials, not comparative. So he wasn't taking homeopathic remedies and placebos and comparing them. He just gave people placebo. So he would give people, so he picked out a group of subjects, again, not randomized, there's no control group, there's no statistics, but placebos. So he just gave them little bread pills with just starch in them, and told them that they were homeopathic remedies and saw what happens. So he found that the bread pills worked about as well as the homeopathic remedies did. So, but this was, again, single blind. He knew which pills were which and involved no careful statistical methods. He rounded up about 10 patients and lied to them about what was happening. Medical ethics were quite different in the 1800s. He gave these fake pills to them with quite a bit of ceremony. So he made a kind of ritual and performance out of giving them the bread pills, and that part of what makes for a good placebo. A lot of ritual and pomp and circumstance actually has been shown to enhance placebo effects. So giving them extensive interviews before and after, telling them to carefully monitor their body for effects, that kind of thing. And he found that that kind of treatment with bread pills, but great ceremony and attention, worked about as well as homeopathic remedies. So Kapchuk reports that the first double-blind trial, so this is the next, we've been talking about blind trials, the first double-blind trial was also done on homeopathic remedies. There was a comparison between homeopathic remedies and sugar pills, and both the doctors and the patients were kept ignorant of which one was which. But the first trials, which were done in the 1880s, were inconclusive, and as it was hard to get people to sign up. So again, as I think I described in the first video, if somebody told you, hey, I'd like to try, you're sick, you're scared, you're looking for help, and a doctor says, hey, you know what I want to try? Maybe giving you medicine, and maybe not. I don't know which one's going to be. What do you think? I don't think I would have gone for it either. Unless, in the modern age, I'm like, yeah, okay, I understand a placebo-controlled double-blind study. In 1880, I don't think I would have gone for it. But okay, so in the mid-1800s or so, some clinicians were starting to wonder whether their own medicines were helping. So far, all of the blinded trials and double-blind trials we've talked about are about kind of alternative medicine. People coming from outside of the medical establishment, proposing some zany new treatment, and medical professionals being like, we need to do some careful study on this one. My leeches, we're not going to worry about because I know those work. But your weird homeopathic medicine and your animal magnetism, we're going to test that carefully. So mid-1800s, we begin to see the move to treat traditional mainstream medicine with the same kind of blinded trial. Austin Flint, this guy here, was a doctor from the US, and he was starting to lose faith a little. So he's starting to wonder whether the interventions that were being given were doing any good. So working at a hospital, he tried giving a placebo to 13 patients with rheumatism. Rheumatism is a sort of broad term for joint pain, including arthritis. Arthritis is a sort of one of the things that would have been called rheumatism at the time. So he gave, instead of the traditional medical intervention of the time, he gave them placebos. And he found that the placebos were about as good as their medical intervention. So the case histories of these 13 patients, to his eye, resembled very much the case history of people who were receiving more dramatic medical interventions. Again, there's no control group and there's no careful statistics. So Flint is using his sort of personal judgment and expertise about how rheumatism cases usually develop and comparing, just sort of using his expert judgment and intuition, how these patients treated with placebo did compared to how these cases usually go. So we're at an interesting, the 1850s and Austin Flint's sort of placebo trials are an interesting middle ground between doctors starting to question whether they're this pillar of medical authority, which is the experience of the doctors. Like, look, I've treated hundreds of people with rheumatism. Obviously, I know what I'm doing. So that pillar of medical authority is starting to be questioned. Doctors are starting to go, yeah, I don't know if we know what we're doing here. But he's still using that kind of personal medical experience to judge whether how the placebos worked relative to traditional medicine. So we're in a kind of halfway point between relying on the individual judgment of doctors and starting to do clinical trials, which specifically excludes their personal expertise. Okay. Another point that doctors thought it might be worthwhile applying rigorous placebo-controlled trials was the Brown-Séquard Elixir. So this is Brown-Séquard, Charles Edward Brown-Séquard, and he was a pretty established medical doctor. So he's well respected. He's kind of near the end of his career, but so he's been practicing traditional medicine, standard canonical medicine, for quite some time now. And at which point he proposes that he's got the the elixir of life. He's got a treatment that can revivify older men. So older men, they're losing energy, they're losing vitality as they age. Brown-Séquard claimed that by making an extract from the testicles of various animals like dogs, guinea pigs, bulls, monkeys. So collect some animal testicles, make an extract of the testicles, and then eject it, that you would be revitalized. Your youth would be returned by injecting testicle extract. And this was again a popular sensation. It seems to be the ones that attract a lot of public attention that blind studies were sort of more likely to be applied to. But so Charles Edward Brown-Séquard was using this on himself, using it on patients, and people were like, "Yeah, this is great. I feel great." A doctor named M.G. Variet found the claims in the popular press about this to be a little suspect. He thought, the symbolic value of testicle extract was at least part of the story about what's making people feel better. So, people were talking about this as, quote, the fountain of youth, or, quote, the alchemist's dream. Like this is the stuff that will keep you healthy and vigorous for longer than ever. So Variet tried the extract on 3 elderly men who reported that they felt great. And then he tried injecting saline, so just salt water, telling them, two other men, telling them that it was the extract. And nothing really happened. So they reported no change. But he did do a placebo-controlled trial on this stuff. Right. So as far as I know, testicle extract is not a helpful thing to inject. Despite the apparent success in this trial, don't inject yourself with testicle extract. Okay. So we still got no double-blind studies here, and these studies are still at the point of being used on what you might call questionable medicine by and large. But at least with Brown-Séquard, we're talking about a respected doctor. So this is something from within the medical establishment that's being tested. Just like the last one on rheumatism, the blind studies are starting to be applied at this point in history to mainstream medicine, or the medicine done by well-respected doctors, rather than on the alternative medicine presented by outsiders. Okay, so you're probably wondering when the idea of actual randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies is going to come, because we're getting pretty close to the present in history, right? Kapchuk says, quote, "Until well past World War II, clinical trials consisted overwhelmingly of open-label comparative trials." Which is to say that until well past World War II, placebo controls were not standard. The majority of clinical trials were open-label, meaning both the doctor and the patient know exactly what they're getting. They were not controlled for the placebo effect. And randomization doesn't come around until after some advances in statistics. So the design of experiments advances considerably in the 20th century. One of the people that's sort of responsible for this is this guy, R.A. Fisher, who's not a good man. He's not a good person. He's a good experimental design guy. He's not nice. He's a eugenicist, which is not a good thing to be, and he's a bit smug, frankly, which we'll see in just a minute. But so the familiar experimental design procedure where you randomize similar patients into separate groups and then give one group a placebo and another a medicine, neither the doctors nor the patients know which is which, doesn't really emerge until some advances in statistics led by people like R.A. Fisher. So here's the kind of thing that Fisher had in mind. So in in Fisher's big book on experimental design, he has an example called Lady Drinking Tea, which is roughly based on this actual anecdote from his life. So in 1919, Ronald Fisher was working in a research institute in Britain. And let me just quote you from a history paper on this. So it happened one afternoon when he drew a cup of tea from the urn and offered it to the lady beside him, Dr. B. Muriel Bristol, an algologist. She declined it, saying that she preferred a cup into which the milk had been poured first. "Nonsense," returned Fisher, smiling. "Surely it makes no difference." Smug. But of course, she maintained with emphasis that of course it did. From just behind, a voice suggested, let's test her. So advances in the history of science by disbelieving women. Okay, so Fisher set out 8 cups of tea, 4 of which had milk poured in first, and 4 of which had tea poured in first. There's a 1/2 chance of simply guessing the correct answer for 1 cup. It's either tea first or milk first. And therefore, doing the statistics on this, Muriel Bristol's chances of identifying 4 cups out of 4 prepared in her preferred way was 1 out of 70, or about 1.4%. The chances of identifying 3 out of 4 was 24.3%. So if she got 3 out of 4, it's not as likely as flipping a coin, but it's not super impressive. But if she gets 4 out of 4, there's only a 1.4% chance of that happening just by coincidence. So that's a pretty strong evidence, right? By the way, she identified 4 out of 4. She nailed it. She knew every time which one had tea and which one had milk first. So Fisher's the person who's credited with coming up with p-value. So p less than 0.05 is the threshold for statistical significance. And really roughly, I'm going to mangle this a little, but because it's slightly subtle, but really roughly, p less than 0.05, it means that there's less than 1 in 20 chance of the result being just coincidence. So you run a trial, and if the results have a p-value of less than 0.05, that means that it's less than a 1 in 20 chance that the apparent signal that you got is just chance. You might ask, why 0.05? No reason. Fisher just picked that number out of a hat. It's the number that you're supposed to get. I mean, in modern scientific studies, p less than 0.05 and clinical studies, psychology, that's pretty much the cutoff for getting published. If you can get statistical significance of less than 0.05, you're on the way to publication, and more than that, you're not. Fisher just picked a number. P less than 0.05 is sort of similar to another measure, which is 2 standard deviations off the norm, but that doesn't really matter unless you're doing these calculations by hand, so it's just sort of a slightly handy thing to have. The real reason why we have, fun fact from the history of statistics, why is it p less than 0.05? Nah, no reason. Okay, so, right, so, but the idea of randomized controls comes out of this sort of way of thinking about the probability that something happens by chance, and then comparing your result against a null hypothesis. This all comes out of Ronald Fisher's work on statistics. Okay, so where does that leave us? As late as 1955, the American Medical Association was willing to print the opinion that the evaluation of drugs should, quote, should be kept in the hands of the general practitioner and not be on the basis of experiments. So in 1955, the American Medical Association, the sort of central medical association in America, still thought that doctors who are interacting with patients, who know their specific sort of case history, who know them as individuals, who can use their judgment, should be the ones deciding whether medicines work, rather than large, blinded experiments. But the 1950s also saw a kind of public watershed in thinking about placebo controls. It saw the highly publicized placebo-controlled double-blind trial of the polio vaccine. So, polio is a terrifying illness. I'm glad it's mostly gone from the world. It's not completely gone from the world, but it's nothing like it used to be. So in the early years of the 1950s, there were tens of thousands of cases in the U.S. every year of polio. Polio is a horrifying illness. It affects children. It can paralyze you for life or kill you. It's bad to get polio. So in the 1952, Jonas Salk developed an effective vaccine for it. And they started trials on small groups and eventually moved up to hundreds of thousands of patients. So what's called the Francis Field trial of the vaccine was the largest medical experiment in history at the time. It took place in 1956, and it involved 1.8 million children. About 440,000 were given the vaccine, 210,000 were given a placebo, And the rest, about 1.2 million around there, were given nothing as a control group. And when it was proven safe and effective, Elvis Presley actually got his inoculation live on national. I don't think it was live or not. He got his inoculation on national television. After that, the national immunization levels for this polio vaccine went from 0.6 to about 80%. And gradually, double-blind placebo-controlled studies become the gold standard for evaluating new medicines. And I'm pretty sure after that, nobody ever questioned the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. Don't quote me on that. I haven't looked into it. Okay, so it's the 1950s. It's like mid-50s before placebo-controlled double-blind trials are hitting the big time, which I think is shockingly recent in terms of the development of science.